Sophie's life seemed perfect: a loving husband, 2 beautiful children, and a successful career that allowed her to enjoy the comforts of suburban living. She and James had been married for 15 years, and their life together had followed a predictable rhythm. Morning coffee in hand, Sophie would exchange pleasantries with her husband as he prepared for work. Their routine was comforting, familiar, even if the spark from their earlier years of marriage had started to fade. Lately, Sophie had noticed James's increasing distance, but she chalked it up to the pressures of work. That morning, as they exchanged their usual pleasantries, she noticed a faint change in his demeanor, a forced smile, a coldness that lingered in the air long after he'd left for work. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that the weight of her own life was shifting in ways she didn't fully understand. Still, she didn't question it. After all, life had been steady, and she had always trusted James. But deep down, Sophie couldn't ignore the unsettling thought that something dark was lurking beneath the surface, something that would soon shatter the calm and change everything she thought she knew. The following days unfolded with a strange sense of unease that Sophie couldn't shake. She went through the motions, caring for the children, keeping up with work, and maintaining the house, but the disquiet lingered like a shadow, tugging at the edges of her thoughts. Then one morning, the call came. The voice on the other end was Mark, James's supervisor. Sophie's heart dropped as he informed her that James had collapsed at work and was in the hospital undergoing tests. Her body froze for a moment, and then adrenaline kicked in. She rushed to the car, barely hearing the comforting words Mark spoke, her mind already consumed with worry. What was happening to James? Was he okay? The drive felt endless, the seconds ticking by like hours. When she arrived at the hospital, the sight of James, looking dazed but alive, brought a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. There was an undeniable tension in the room, an atmosphere Sophie couldn't ignore. The doctor's words hit her like a blow. James had been diagnosed with an advanced STI. Sophie's breath caught in her chest as she looked at her husband, who seemed more tense than ever. The confusion was palpable. James's eyes locked with hers, and then he said it, the words that shattered everything. "It's from you," he said coldly. Sophie stood frozen, stunned, as the truth hit her like a freight train. James had cheated. But the real question hung in the air, unanswered: how had this happened? The drive home was suffocating, a thick silence settling between Sophie and James as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. Every turn of the wheel felt heavy, like the weight of their unraveling marriage was pressing down on her chest. Sophie's mind raced. How had this happened? What had James done? She couldn't look at him, not with the accusation in his voice still echoing in her head. The last few months of their marriage seemed to unravel before her eyes. He'd always been distant, but now it felt like there was something more, something darker, more deliberate. They had lived together for 15 years, raising children and building a life, and now it all seemed like a lie. She finally couldn't hold back anymore. "How long?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. James didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight, laced with guilt, yet strangely detached. "I don't know." The lack of certainty in his voice made her stomach twist. This wasn't just a slip, a mistake. It was something that had been happening for a while. "How long?" She pressed again, her voice shaking. "More than once," he admitted finally, his words a gut punch. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. For 15 years, she had stood by him, trusted him completely. And now, she didn't know who he was anymore. The world she had built with him shattered in an instant, leaving her drowning in confusion and betrayal. The tension between Sophie and James hung in the air as they walked into the house. It was as if everything around them had turned to static, every step feeling heavier than the last. Sophie tried to focus on the mundane tasks, putting away the groceries, organizing the kitchen, but each movement felt mechanical, disconnected from the whirlwind inside her mind. She couldn't escape the image of the hotel keycard in her hand earlier, the cold realization that James had been hiding something for months, maybe even longer. Her mind raced, wondering what she had missed, what signs she had overlooked while she was too wrapped up in their day-to-day life. She glanced over at James, his back turned, and she felt a strange ache in her chest. This man, the one she had shared her life with, had become a stranger. It wasn't just the affair. It was the deception, the lies that had been woven into the fabric of their marriage, the trust she had built so carefully now torn apart. Sophie's hands trembled as she set down a glass, her pulse pounding in her ears. "How could you do this to me?" she whispered, not expecting an answer. She hadn't planned on confronting him, not yet, but the weight of the truth pressed on her chest like a vice. She needed answers. She needed the closure he had been too cowardly to offer. The silence between them stretched, suffocating, until finally, James turned to face her, his eyes weary, and the story of their unraveling began to pour out, piece by painful piece. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that everything she had built was crumbling around her, bit by bit. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now seemed suffocating, filled with memories that had turned sharp and jagged. As she sat on the couch, the weight of the secret James had been keeping from her pressed down on her chest. Her mind replayed the moment when she discovered the hotel key card. The realization had been like a punch to the gut, the sharp sting of betrayal leaving her breathless. She had spent years cultivating a life of trust, only to have it shattered by one simple, undeniable truth: James had been lying to her. The next few days felt like walking through fog. Everything felt hazy and out of focus. She tried to keep the routine of everyday life intact, making dinner, talking to the girls, keeping up appearances, but it was all a facade. Every glance at James sent her heart into a spiral, her eyes searching his face for some hint of guilt, something that would explain the distance between them. But there was nothing. He was just as quiet, just as distant as he had been before. Sophie hated the silence that had overtaken their home. She hated the fact that she was living with a stranger. But what hurt the most was the fact that, even after everything, she still wanted him to love her again. She still wanted to believe that this wasn't the end. Sophie's world had turned upside down, but she was trying to hold it together. The discovery of the hotel keycard had left a gnawing emptiness in her chest, one that made every heartbeat feel louder, sharper. Each time she glanced at James, it was like looking at a stranger. The man she thought she knew, the man who had been her partner for so many years, was now someone wrapped in lies. The trust that had once been the cornerstone of their marriage had been shattered in a single devastating moment. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together the fragments of their life. Was everything a lie? Had she always been the only one in the relationship, while he had secretly withdrawn? Sophie couldn't stand the quiet tension that had settled between them, the unspoken words hanging in the air like thick fog. The unease that had built up inside her felt suffocating, each glance at James reminding her of the betrayal that had tainted their life together. But Sophie wasn't one to let things fester in silence. She wasn't going to let this lie slide under the rug, pretend everything was fine while her world continued to crumble. She needed answers, answers that might not make everything better, but answers nonetheless. She couldn't fix something without understanding the depth of the cracks. Sophie stood in front of him that night, no longer willing to pretend, her voice steady but filled with a raw vulnerability. "James, I need to know the truth. Every part of it." The days that followed the confrontation felt like a slow unraveling. Sophie's heart was heavy, the weight of James's betrayal sitting like a stone in her chest. Each interaction with him seemed tinged with a quiet desperation, as if both of them were waiting for something to give. She had asked him for the truth, but his response had been a murky silence, an unwillingness to fully open up, to admit the full scope of what had happened. Sophie's mind whirled with thoughts of what she didn't know, what had been hidden from her, and how much of their life had been a facade. She began to take control of her own emotions, becoming more focused, more determined. The thought of finding peace, of reclaiming herself, became her anchor. Sophie started to take deliberate steps, reaching out to her friends, allowing herself moments of quiet contemplation. She knew she couldn't move forward if she kept looking back. Still, every night she wrestled with her feelings, torn between the love she had for James and the betrayal that gnawed at her from within. Sophie also began to see herself differently. She was no longer just the wife or the partner who had been wronged. She was an individual, deserving of respect, deserving of truth. Slowly, she started putting her pieces back together, even if the picture wasn't clear yet. But the most important thing was that she was taking the reins of her life again, no longer allowing the actions of others to dictate her peace. As the weeks went by, Sophie found herself living in a strange limbo, caught between the past and the future. The tension between her and James was undeniable. His presence in their home, once so comforting, now felt like a constant reminder of what had been broken. Every moment together felt fragile, like they were walking on eggshells, pretending for the sake of normalcy. But in the quiet of the night, when Sophie lay awake staring at the ceiling, she realized that pretending had become the most exhausting part of all. She didn't know how much longer she could keep up the facade of a life that no longer felt like hers. Then one evening, Sophie received a call from Rachel Turner, James's former colleague, the woman whose name had haunted her thoughts since the affair was revealed. The conversation started out casually, but soon Rachel's voice took on a more serious tone. "Sophie, I think you need to know something," she said, her words heavy with unspoken truths. Sophie's stomach twisted with anticipation, a storm brewing inside her as Rachel continued, revealing the extent of James's lies, things Sophie never knew, things she had feared were true but hadn't been able to face. The truth hit Sophie harder than she expected. But in that moment, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to be the victim anymore. The weight of the lies, the deceit, it all suddenly became fuel, propelling her forward. She didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to live in the shadows of James's mistakes anymore. The road ahead was uncertain, but Sophie knew she was ready to start walking it. Sophie's days blurred together in a haze of mundane routines and lingering resentment. James's attempts to make amends were half-hearted at best, and Sophie couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that their marriage was beyond saving. Every time she looked at him, she saw not the man she had once trusted, but the stranger who had betrayed her. The ache in her chest only deepened as she reflected on how she had allowed herself to believe in the lies for so long. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about everything she had sacrificed, the years spent supporting him, the compromises that left her emotionally bankrupt. But something shifted within her when she took a quiet evening for herself. As she curled up on the couch with a book, a rare sense of clarity washed over her. She was more than just the sum of her husband's betrayals, more than the role she had played in their fractured marriage. She had forgotten what it felt like to put herself first, to recognize her own worth outside of her relationship with James. The realization stung, but it also ignited a quiet strength within her. Sophie knew that no matter how painful it was, she needed to take control of her own story. The next morning, when James asked if they could try again, Sophie felt no rush to give him an answer. The truth was, she had already begun the process of healing, not for him, but for herself. It wasn't about reconciliation anymore. It was about finding her own peace, even if it meant walking away from the man she had loved. The weeks following the confrontation felt like an endless cycle of emotional turmoil. Sophie had never imagined that her life could unravel so completely in such a short time. Every morning, she awoke with a sense of heaviness, her thoughts circling around the betrayal that had shattered her world. James's guilt was palpable, but it did little to ease the sting of his actions. Sophie had given him everything, and yet he had chosen to seek solace in another woman's arms. It was a betrayal of trust, of everything they had built together. And yet, as much as the pain threatened to consume her, Sophie knew one thing with unshakable clarity: she deserved more. Every day felt like a battle between what was and what could be, but Sophie refused to let herself be defined by the past. In the quiet moments, she allowed herself to grieve, to process the anger and sadness. But those moments were fleeting. Slowly, she started to let go of the weight she had carried for so long. She spent more time doing things that made her feel whole again: journaling, walking, reconnecting with old friends. For the first time in years, Sophie felt like she was finding herself again, and that realization sparked something inside her, a fierce determination to move forward, no matter how daunting the road ahead might be. The future was hers to shape, one step at a time. The day Sophie decided to take back control was a turning point she hadn't expected. It started as any other, with the weight of her shattered marriage looming over her, but something inside her shifted that morning. She no longer wanted to be defined by the betrayal, the sadness, or the suffocating sense of betrayal that James had left her with. She was tired of being stuck in a cycle of anger and helplessness. She knew she had to start somewhere, and today was as good a day as any. After work, Sophie ventured out of her routine and walked to the nearby park, something simple, yet unfamiliar. The air was crisp with the first signs of autumn, and as she walked along the path, the stillness of nature mirrored the quiet space inside her mind. There, beneath the canopy of trees, she felt the tension loosen from her shoulders, and a small but powerful realization dawned on her: she didn't need to wait for anyone's permission to live the life she wanted. For the first time in weeks, Sophie didn't feel like a prisoner of her emotions. She felt empowered by the freedom to choose her next step. That night, Sophie sat down with a pen and paper, writing down her dreams and goals. It wasn't about the past anymore, it was about the future. She was ready to rebuild, to grow, and to make herself proud once again. The final blow came when Sophie found out about James's second betrayal. It wasn't just the affair anymore, it was the lies that followed, the manipulation that had seeped into every corner of their life together. She thought she knew him, trusted him, but the man she had built her world around had morphed into someone unrecognizable. As the truth unraveled, Sophie was left gasping for breath, caught between the reality of his deceit and the overwhelming weight of the years spent building a life that was nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. It was late one night when Sophie received the message from the private investigator: photographs, financial documents, and a paper trail that confirmed everything she had feared. The house, the children, the promises made and broken, it was all tainted by this hidden life James had built. She wasn't angry at first, not like she thought she would be. Instead, she felt a numbness, a deep exhaustion that had been creeping in for months. Sophie had been playing a role for so long, wife, mother, caretaker, but now she realized she didn't even know who she was anymore. She had been so focused on saving a marriage that had already ended that she forgot to save herself. Sophie sat in silence for what felt like hours, staring at the evidence in front of her. The clarity hit like a thunderclap. She needed to let go. It was time to stop pretending, to face the truth and step. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she understood it was necessary. Sophie took the next step in silence, unsure of what lay ahead, but knowing that staying in the darkness wasn't an option. The house felt colder now, its walls echoing with years of unanswered questions and unspoken regrets. She had spent so long holding on to James, her love for him suffocating under the weight of his betrayal. But as she packed her bags, her heart felt a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in ages, Sophie could hear her own voice again, clear, strong, and finally unburdened by the ghosts of the past. She had loved James with all she had, but that love wasn't enough to heal the wounds he had inflicted. The moment she stepped out of the house, Sophie felt the weight of her decisions settle over her. She wasn't running away, she was reclaiming her life. There were no more lies to catch her, no more nights spent trying to fix something broken beyond repair. The world outside seemed brighter, even though it was early morning, and the air felt sharp and crisp. She wasn't sure where she was going next, but that uncertainty felt empowering instead of frightening. For the first time in years, Sophie was no longer trying to please anyone but herself. As the days passed, Sophie began to rediscover the woman she had once been, the ambitious, free-spirited girl who had lost herself in the role of wife and mother. Slowly, but surely, Sophie started to rebuild her life, piece by piece. There was no rush now. She was finding herself again. And for the first time in a long time, Sophie felt alive. In life, it's easy to get caught in routines, relationships, and obligations that may leave us feeling lost or unappreciated. The story of Sophie shows that sometimes, we need to face difficult truths and walk away from situations that no longer serve us. In today's world, self-care and self-respect are crucial. Don't let fear of change or judgment hold you back from seeking happiness and peace. Trust yourself enough to make difficult decisions, whether it's leaving a toxic relationship or setting new boundaries. Remember, taking control of your life is a sign of strength, not weakness.